Hello. Hello, good evening, everyone, or good afternoon, or good morning, wherever you are. And we welcome you to the new West Philippine Sea Catch. And the theme of today's event is the collision of two Chinese vessels in the West Philippine Sea. What does it mean for the Philippines? And of course, we have our our guest speaker for tonight, uh, who will be introduced later. And before we go to the main event, let us uh, let us put our right hand over our left chest for our Philippine national anthem, Lupang Hinirang.
Bayang magiliw, perlas ng silanganan, alab ng puso, sa dibdib mo'y buhay. Lupang hinira, duyan ka ng magiting, sa manlulupit, di ka pasisiil, sa dagat at bundok, sa simoy at sa langit mo'y bugaw. May dilag at tula at awit sa paglayang minamahal. Ang kislap ng watawat mo'y tagumpay na nagniningning. Ang bituin at araw niyang kailan pag may magdidilim. Lupa ng araw ng hatid pagsinta. Buhay namin sa piling mo. Aming ligaya na may mga api ang mamatay ng dahil sa'yo. Makamay! Ha!
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, as always, after our Lupang Hinirang, I always give credit and acknowledge and salute to our brave military men who planted the Philippine flag at the Sandy Cay, one which is about 2 nautical miles away from Pag-asa Island or the Tito Island. Salute to all of you, our hero. And now, of course, I would like to introduce our my co-host, uh, Captain Tagal Caruso Mario Antonio Tagal. He is a former military pilot and a retired airline pilot of the Philippine Airlines. He is the director of membership of the National Youth Movement for the West Philippine Sea, and he is also our corporate secretary and treasurer of the National Youth Movement for the West Philippine Sea, Incorporated. As all you know, NYMWPS is a SEC registered non-profit organization in the Philippines. And of course, with me is Professor Ron Lampkin. Uh, he's, uh, he's a lifetime member, advisor, and consultant of the National Youth Movement for the West Philippine Sea. I would like to read first our disclaimer. Uh, any views, opinions, comments, or presentation of facts of the guest speakers, panelists, guests, attendees, and netizens are personal and do not necessarily reflect the stand and opinions of the National Youth Movement for the West Philippine Sea, nor the organizations they are affiliated with. And for our guest speaker, Captain Carl Schuster is a retired U.S. Navy. He's a defense and security consultant for issues related to Indo-Pacific affairs, and he served in the U.S. Navy for 25 years and retired after 24 years of teaching at Hawaii Pacific University, Honolulu, Hawaii, where he taught diplomacy, military science program, military science program. He was the former director of the operations of at a U.S. Pacific Command's Joint Intelligence Center near Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Captain Schuster, who lives in Honolulu, is Hawaii, is a freelance writer with over 700 articles of military history and current events and 3 books published. And now, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor and a pleasure to introduce to our guest speaker and who has been my co-host for more than a month in this new West Philippine Sea Catch, live from Honolulu, Hawaii, Captain Carl O. Schuster. Good evening, Captain Carl.
Good evening, Dr. Lampkin. I hope it sounds like you had the flu. I hope you get better.
Thank
And thank
you.
you for having me. It's always a pleasure to be here and an honor. And you always have kind words for me, but I hope everyone remembers that it was Dr. Lampkin that got this whole process started, and that much of the progress we see in this year are the result of the work she's been doing for almost 5 years. So a good hands up, clap, bring your hands together for her. And I'll start now with my rather minor role, which I'll talk about the collision that occurred on the 12th of August of this year. If I can bring up the slides.
Okay. I can share a PowerPoint.
Oh, yeah,
Yes.
I should,
Then I can just share later the two
okay.
pictures of
Absolutely.
the two pictures of the
Of the warships themselves. I was able
yes,
finally to find the
right.
latest data on particularly the Coast Guard vessel, which was a converted naval vessel.
All
I had
right.
a picture of the naval vessel, but I didn't have a picture of the converted Coast Guard vessel until about an hour ago. So anyway, what we're going to go through first and foremost is what I call the battle of the videos. The early Philippine videos that got published clearly showed the Chinese executed very poor and unsafe seamanship. So if we could go to the next slide. Now, it's a major embarrassment for the People's Republic of China. A naval unit, a PLA Navy unit, and a People's Armed Police Coast Guard vessel collided. And yet they were supposed to be working together, and I'll go into that later. But what they were trying to do was scissor the Philippine Coast Guard vessel, which was much smaller and slower than the warship, but about the same maximum speed as the Coast Guard cutter. Now, the early unedited videos from the Philippines proved that the PLA Navy guided missile destroyer was responsible for unsafe seamanship and the collision itself. But to counter its embarrassment, the China's Global Times released the following very heavily edited video. And if we can click on it, let me see if I can get it. Here we go. Oh, don't know what that means. Oh, I can't get the video to play. But anyway, what happened was The Global Times found the incident so embarrassing that they took a video from the guided missile destroyer and a video from the Coast Guard cutter, their Coast Guard cutter, and professionally edited them to make it look like it was one continuous video, when in fact, it's very obvious that the first 3/4 of the video is from the guided missile destroyer long before the collision occurred. And you can tell that because the Coast Guard ship's not moving very fast. It doesn't have what we call bone in its teeth. The second thing is at the end, the perspective is changed. It is either from the DDG looking over its bow, or it's from the Coast Guard vessel a few minutes before it ran into the guided missile destroyer. And the reason you know that is it also tells you what the Chinese were trying to do. The distance between the video camera and the stern of the Coast Guard, Philippine Coast Guard ship is very short, not more than 200 meters. And yet a collision occurred and there's no image of the guided missile destroyer cutting across the Chinese Coast Guard cutter's path. So you're looking at an edited video taken long before the collision, but it also tells you what the Chinese Coast Guard vessel was trying to achieve. And that is they were trying to bump the stern of the Philippine Coast Guard vessel to slow it down or disable it. And the Philippine captain was able to avoid that. But China's trying to use that maneuver to say it caused the collision, which is kind of like saying the mugger who broke his hand assaulting you, it's your fault for having too strong a bone structure. I mean, it's just a classic misdirection that won't fool anyone that's ever spent a day at sea. So the video, their video shows two things. The DDG never shows up at all. And the close-up proves what the Chinese Coast Guard vessel was trying to do. Now, next slide. Okay, now in this one, Philippine Coast Guard vessel was clearly being pursued by two People's Republic of China maritime warships. One, a guided missile destroyer from the PLA Navy, and the other, a large cutter that was converted from a warship of the PLA Navy. Now, the Chinese cutter has a top speed of around 25 knots. The Philippine Coast Guard vessel has a top speed of around 25 knots. So, Coast Guard vessel was doing a very good job of ducking and dodging because the warship has a top speed of around 31 knots. So he was the faster vessel trying to shove the Philippine Coast Guard cutter into the path of the Chinese Coast Guard cutter. However, the crew of the guided missile destroyer misjudged the distance. They cut in front of their Coast Guard cutter at too close a range. Now, if we can get this video to show. Oh, won't do it.
I can,
Yeah,
Captain Sister, probably, I can show this video if you want, then I have to stop this PowerPoint first. Is
that's
that
okay.
okay with you?
We'll do it at the end when I'm done, and that way
Yes,
we'll
yeah.
kind of break.
I think that's better. Thank you.
And when you look at the videos, you'll notice the ranges involved and that the PRC Coast Guard cutter was operating its water cannon and attempting to come up the Philippine cutter's starboard side, which means he was cheating to the right or to starboard, and the naval vessel was trying to cut across him and get on the port side of the Philippine Coast Guard cutter. And the goal was to sandwich the Coast Guard cutter between them. Next slide. So what does this mean? Well, one thing that I've drawn from it is that China's decided to escalate its operations against the Philippines with joint PLA Navy and Coast Guard operations. The new Philippine Coast Guard cutters have a much higher speed than those of 5 and 6 years ago. The result is it's much more difficult to bully them. But a PLA Navy warship is almost invariably going to be faster than a Coast Guard cutter. So the two were working together. They were trying to scissor the Philippine ship. If they couldn't cripple it by bumping or ramming it, then they hoped the Chinese Coast Guard cutter's water cannon could cripple it. And by that, I mean either take out the pilot house, because the water cannon have a PSI, pounds per square inch pressure, of over 500 pounds, some say 1,000 pounds per square inch. That hits a human being, it breaks bones. It hits a typical bridge window, it shatters the glass. But typically what they try to do is flood the intakes to the engine room. Cold seawater hitting diesel and gas turbine engines or a steam boiler cracks and destroys the propulsion system, which of course disables the ship. So, embarrassed by their failure, Beijing is trying to claim the Philippine Coast Guard cutter caused the collision by avoiding the Chinese attempts to ram it. I find that argument so ludicrous, I'm surprised anyone would believe it and fall for it. But I have discovered there are people who believe it. Under international law, you are allowed to duck and dodge anyone trying to harm your vessel. So, with two ships trying to ram or bump him, the Philippine Coast Guard vessel was fully justified under international law and rules of the road to avoid the collisions. Under extremis, with your ship in danger, you are allowed to do what is necessary to save your ship. And he did that masterfully, I might add. Now, what do I think is going to happen down the road? I think the decision, the immediate decision after the collision is, let's not do that again until we develop new procedures to ensure we don't have a similar accident in the future. Those sort of high-speed, close-range, intense maneuvers require a lot of practice. And it's obvious those two ships did not practice together a lot. And that's not unusual. Coast Guards rarely work with navies. Navies focus on broad ocean areas. Coast Guards typically worry about coastal waters out to the economic exclusion zone. Next slide. Now, this is the tactic they were trying. It's a new tactic only in that a high-speed naval ship was involved. Traditionally, they have maritime militia moving to constrain or inhibit the maneuvering of the Philippine or Vietnamese ship, and then a Coast Guard cutter comes in and bumps them. And if it's a wooden-hulled target, then typically that cracks the hull and sinks it. If it's a metal target, if they can get that water cannon to take out the pilot house or go down the engine intakes, then they cripple the ship and they can do whatever they want after that. So what we're looking at here is an escalation. They're bringing their Navy into play, and that means that the Coast Guard, the Philippine Coast Guard, and the Philippine government's done a masterful job of embarrassing the Chinese, and they aren't sure how to react, so they went to what aggressive nations typically do, they escalate. But they did it in a way they hoped would win their points and force the Philippines to back down. And instead, they rammed one of their own ships. It's going to be out of action for 4 to 6 months. The destroyer doesn't appear to have taken serious damage, but I'll bet money they're having to do some kind of repairs to the hull and maybe some of the internal machinery or electrical equipment. It's not very serious damage, but I noticed they weren't running around 30 knots after that, so it did something. So, next slide. So, they're going to become more aggressive. They just won't do it in the near term over the next couple of months. They won't do it with the Navy and Coast Guard working together. What they'll do is you'll see what they've done about the last 2 weeks, and that is have their aircraft harass your aircraft and your helicopters, and low buzz your cutters, your Coast Guard cutters. They may also stage fighter aircraft out of onto Fury Cross Reef or Second Thomas Shoal, or one of the other military garrisons they have with an airfield. The goal there is to threaten you with a military force. Once again, I don't think they'll attack, but they're hoping they can bully you. Now, it may be a few months before another joint PLA Navy Chinese Coast Guard operation is attempted. The Southern Theater Command is the military command responsible for what China does in the South China Sea. And in those operations, the Coast Guard operationally falls under the Southern Theater Command. Administratively, they're part of the People's Armed Police. They're like a border control force. They're a paramilitary organization. Theoretically, they have a law enforcement function, but most of the typical Coast Guard law enforcement functions fall to the Maritime Safety Agency, which, by the way, is also very large, has over 240 ocean-going ships, as does the Chinese Coast Guard. It has around 248. So until those new procedures are developed, surface gray zone ops will resume in the traditional fashion, with the Coast Guard and the People's Armed Forces Maritime Militia working together using the tactics of the past, as I described in the previous slide. I would also expect China to employ drones. They have a lot of them, and they have some very large ones, and drones are cheaper, more expendable, and they're viewed as less threatening than manned aircraft. And so it allows them to up the ante without appearing to commit an act of war. So that's what's coming, I think. Barring that, next slide, questions.
Thank you very much, Captain Schuster. I can, oh,
I tried to keep it under 20 minutes,
no,
but
that's fine. But we can share the picture of, okay, would you like to accept the questions now, or would you like to share
share the videos, because that provides the background to most of the answers.
Okay, all right. So we will, okay, Attorney Loida, she's raising her hand. Then after this, Attorney Loida, we will be calling you. Yes, thank you so much. Attorney Loida Nicolas Luis. Okay, we would like to share first the video of I always say that it's a fake video from China.
Yeah.
All right. So that
Show it and I'll explain it.
Yes, I think this is the one. I guess. Let's see. From the Global Times there.
There we go. Take note. Coast Guard vessel is accelerating. Philippine vessel is turning. Now, in my view, this is the Coast Guard vessel, Chinese Coast Guard vessel. One of my friends argued it's not, because there's a gun mount there that isn't in the Coast Guard vessel. Now, you'll notice the Chinese ended the video at that point. In my view, the video station is less than 100 meters from the stern of the Philippine Coast Guard vessel. And at that range, the Chinese guided missile destroyer should be in the view. It's not. So that video was clearly taken before the collision, well before the collision. So they're taking images, if you will, and video from before the collision, long before the collision, to say, see, the Philippine vessel turning to avoid us caused the collision. You know, if a mugger throws a punch and you duck and he hits a brick building and breaks his hand, it's not your fault he broke his hand. Okay? That's the logic that I believe. The Chinese would argue that the mugger's victim is at fault. He should have taken the punch so the mugger wouldn't have suffered any hand damage. It's such a ludicrous defense, and I'm using a parallel here, obviously a metaphor, but the video doesn't show what it purports to show. Where's the guided missile destroyer? Where's the point of impact? Not only that, the Coast Guard cutter was the Chinese Coast Guard cutter was further away from the Philippine Coast Guard cutter when the collision occurred than it is in the Chinese video.
Mhm.
So that tells you that the video is probably consists of real footage, but it's been edited to provide a dishonest picture and tell a dishonest narrative.
So thank you so much. Would you like me to show the Philippine
Well,
video?
let's show the
Right.
second one, and it'll
Okay.
actually accentuate what I just said about the Chinese video.
All right, thank you. So I will show the one from the Philippine Coast Guard. I think this is the one. Yes. Let's see. Put there.
Yep, here we go. Now you'll notice the Chinese Coast Guard vessel already has his cannon up and operating, and he's trying to come up on the Philippine Coast Guard vessel's starboard side. And he's slowly catching up, probably because the Philippine vessel did a turn to avoid an earlier attempt to ram him. And he's making good progress. Closing. Now, at this point, he's about 100 meters behind the Coast Guard vessel. Coast Guard vessel's turn, putting the Chinese vessel on his port side. So the Chinese vessel is now trying to bump your stern, turn to bring the water cannon into play, and then bam. What the Chinese naval vessel should have done was decelerated, cut behind the Chinese Coast Guard vessel, and then come up the Philippine ship's port side. Now you'll notice the very minor damage on the guided missile destroyer. They've lost some paint, probably suffered a shock. And if you look closely, a couple of the Chinese Coast Guardsmen have fallen in the water. And about a third of the bow area no longer exists. It's been crushed. Now, what I found interesting is the Chinese naval vessel did not go back to rescue the crewmen in the water. Now, they did order apparently some Chinese fishing boats and maritime militia to look for something, and they did a bunch of what we call search patterns for several hours into the night. But clearly, the naval ship and the Coast Guard vessel were under orders to harass and disable that Philippine ship without firing any shots. And the naval vessel doesn't have a water cannon, so ramming's his only option. And you'll notice that he's slowed down a bit. And the Philippine vessel is able to get away, if you will, although he did slow down later, and he did offer to assist in the recovery of the Chinese sailors, but never got a response. And because of the threatening actions of the guided missile destroyer, he had to make the, I think, prudent decision to pull away. There are two Chinese vessels in vicinity of the men. They're countrymen. Why didn't they stop to rescue their own people? Under international law, mariners in the water are to be rescued. And under US Navy regulations, if I leave someone in the water without at least trying to recover them, I face punishment. Can be a court-martial offense, although we haven't done that in 30 years, actually 40 years. but the potential is there. So once again, you see three things: poor seamanship and unsafe navigational practice. One, the close order zigzagging. Two, uncoordinated cut in front of a ship without warning, without coordination. After the collision, no effort made to recover the people knocked off the bow of the Coast Guard ship, the Chinese Coast Guard ship. So, a pretty embarrassing story in my view, if I was Chinese.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, Captain Sister. Captain Sister, there are two more photos, I would like to share from
Sure.
your slides. Uh, this one.
Yep. Now that's the Type 52 DL, and it's called DL because it's got a longer flight deck on the stern. You will notice that it has a top speed of around 30 knots. So it has a 4-knot advantage over the Philippine Coast Guard vessel. And you'll notice it has a lot of weapons, a lot of electronics, including land attack cruise missiles. They have 13 of them in commission as of the middle of 2024. They probably have 14 or 15 in service by now. And in the next slide, I finally got a picture
Yeah.
of.
Yes, I will share the other one.
Okay, thank you. Sorry to put you in so much trouble. If I was more
No,
IT smart, this would go smoother.
no, it's okay, no problem. That was that the blue one? Did they share the blue one? That's it.
Yeah. No, that's the 52 DL. That's the one you just showed.
I'm sorry about that. Yeah,
Right.
sorry about that.
Not to worry. I should be able to do warship recognition given,
No
40.
problem. No problem. That that should be the right
There we
one.
go.
That's the one. Thank
Now,
you.
this is the model. It's called a Genkai. And this is there are 22 of these in Philippine Coast Guard service, and they are converted missile corvettes. And you'll notice a 26 knot top speed. So they're slightly faster than the Coast Guard vessel. They're diesel powered. The naval version has a lot of ASW, anti-submarine warfare weapons and sensors. The Coast Guard version has a 30 millimeter automatic cannon in the front. And of course, the crew carries small arms. And in contrast to most Chinese Coast Guard vessels, it only has one water cannon. And I think that's probably because the warship didn't have one. The warship version didn't have one. And to put a powerful water cannon up there, as you see, it's between the two stacks. That requires a lot of very expensive engineering in fabrication. You got to cut a hole in several decks and run the piping up. And it can't be lightweight piping. It's got to be built to withstand whatever pressure you're pumping. And you got to mount the pump somewhere. So they went with one pump, or one water cannon. I call it one pump because in the Navy we call it a pump. But one water cannon, one 30 millimeter cannon, and the crew's small arms. And you'll notice, however, its displacement's around 1,500 tons. So it's about 600 tons larger than the Philippine Coast Guard vessel. And the PLA Navy unit has a standard displacement of 7,200 tons. It's slightly smaller than a Arleigh Burke class guided missile destroyer. Carries a helicopter, actually both of them do. So those are the two ships that were chasing you, and those are the two ships that collided.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thank you so much, Captain Sister, for sharing, the type of two Chinese ships that collided. Thank you so much. So I think I'll be reading a question from our Zoom registrants, and for those who have questions also here at the webinar. Okay, there is a question coming from Attorney Lloyda Nicholas Lewis. Uh, she is, of course, as you know, a prominent Phil community civic leader and a global leader and the chair of the U.S. Filipinos for Good Governance from New York City, USA. Her question is, what would be the proper defense if and when China uses drones to harass the Philippine Coast Guard? Captain Schuster.
I think if it doesn't attack you physically, then the only thing you can do is maneuver to avoid collision. Typically, what they'll do with a drone is they will buzz you. They'll come fly at you and then lift up to about an altitude of 50 to 100 meters. The result is it gives you the what I call the visual pause of something about to hit you, and at the last second it doesn't. It's purely an intimidation tactic. And here's the risk you take. If it's flying that low, you could water cannon it yourself. And a water cannon hits a light drone, that drone's toast. But I don't think the Chinese will use that small a drone. I think they'll use one of their little, 1 to 2 ton size drones, so that that'll deter you from not, trying to down it with a water cannon. So the only thing you can do is duck and dodge it, or have one of your drones, harass their drone. And, who knows? Have one of your $50 drones collide with one of their $500,000 drones, and accidents happen. But it gives them a propaganda victory, of course. And so you have a 2-tiered problem. You have to avoid their drone causing you to make a mistake, and you have to do it in a way that doesn't give them a propaganda victory. Everything the Chinese are doing has a political warfare angle. They're trying to shape the media narrative, media warfare as they call it, to develop or shape the political warfare, the political opinion battle, which is called political opinion warfare or psychological warfare if it's a military application. And then the hope is to develop a political movement to change international law or regional laws in China's favor. And so it's also called lawfare or law warfare. And China treats it as an integrated, their doctrine integrates all three. And it operates 24/7 in peacetime, and it simply intensifies in conflict and war. So the only thing you can do is duck, dodge, and not give them a political victory.
All right, thank you so much to the question of Attorney Lloyd and Nicholas Lewis from New York City, and for your excellent response and insights, Captain Schuster. There is a question from, University Professor Dr. Dries Larapi of the University of Ivy Antropal from Morocco. First, it's like a comment, of course, China should respect the Charter of the United Nations, and notably the Articles 4 and 2, Paragraph 4. The question is, in pursuant of international law, could this resort to the peaceful means of settling disputes be a final solution to these clashes? Thank you.
Well, of course, obviously, if we could find a peaceful solution, that would be the way to go. The problem is, China, like any other authoritarian aggressor, says all the right words and then does all the wrong actions. You believe China, everything they do is peaceful and lawful and doesn't harm anyone. And it doesn't harm the environment. They just released a propaganda study that said that they were the ones protecting the maritime environment in the South China Sea. No mention of their mass harvesting of the clams or the destruction of 3.4 million hectares of marine environment. They put up a couple of navigation beacons and a couple of research centers and say, see, we're moving to protect. And there are people that look at that announcement and say, yeah, that's great. The rest of the world should do that too. Here's the problem. So they put up a couple of, showboat research centers. What are they doing physically? And the answer to that is they're destroying the environment. And the environmental groups who would normally harp on that aren't even mentioning. And I think the answer to that is follow the money. Greenpeace once admitted that there's no money in suing a communist country back when they were challenged for not going after Russia's environmental record. Most people don't realize the Aral Sea used to be the world's largest freshwater lake. Now it's barely the size of Goose Creek Reservoir in South Carolina. Over 85%, and some say 95% of its volume is gone because of the Soviet Union's water practices. Well, here's China saying they're protecting the environment by producing and selling windmills and solar panels. But what they don't mention is they built more new coal-fired thermal plants in China over the last 2 years than the rest of the world combined. They're not making windmills and solar panels to save the world. They're making windmills and solar panels to make money. And so to hear them say that their intentions are peaceful while they're doing things like we just saw and like we've seen them do in the past means that they're not really interested. The only peaceful, well, they're interested in a peaceful resolution, one where they get everything they want and everyone else just smiles about it. But a real solution where everyone gives a little to get a little, they're not interested in that. They want it all. And so how do you get a peaceful solution when one of the players isn't interested in a peaceful solution? Or the peaceful solution they're interested in means everyone else is conquered. Hitler wanted to peacefully occupy Poland. Did he do that?
Mm-hmm.
So, it's the same as, I'm not saying Xi is a Hitler, but I am saying that the same principles and practices from a foreign policy and aggression perspective are in play, and Xi is the puppet master working the strings. Sorry, one of my mini soapboxes.
Okay. Thank you so much, Cafe Schuster, for that excellent response, and of course to the question of our participant. There's a question from Mr. Alphonse Vita. From a more personal and theoretical perspective, I would like to ask your expert opinion on research topics which could fill the gap in existing knowledge with regard to the Chinese encroachment in the West Philippine Sea, and how can we utilize academic research in reinforcing our government's approach in dealing with the issues in the West Philippine Sea? How
Well,
can we also get government to adopt research-driven recommendations into their policies? Thank you.
sure, that's a good question. And to be honest, there are not only academic studies that have been done, there are academic studies being done. We had Professor Bolden, the French PhD, talk 3 weeks ago, I think, where he talked about some of the ecological damage of China's policies. And last year, we had a PhD candidate that talked about that as well. The academic studies are there, and they're growing. The problem we have, I think, is the governments have grown accustomed to having the traditional environmental groups bring these things to light and apply pressure. And those groups, who were always dominated by left-leaning people, which is why they have a 60-year history of never criticizing a left-wing dictatorship. They never complained about Russia's nuclear waste or Russia's environmental programs, and they've never complained about China's or North Korea's or any other left-wing country. If it's a left-wing dictatorship, they don't complain about Cuba's. They aren't complaining about Venezuela's. But they'll sue the Philippine government and the American government for millions of dollars if one of our ships or your ships bumps into a coral reef. But they won't even protest China ripping up 107 square kilometers of coral reefs. And so what we've got to do, my view, we need to find a pressure group outside the traditional environmental groups and bring that information to public eyes and government eyes, and then have the governments ask the traditional environmental groups, hey, this evidence is obvious and it's out there in the public domain. You're our experts on environmental damage. You haven't written one sentence about this in 25 years. What's going on? Because they get millions in donations every year. If those donating money to them knew that they weren't reporting or following Chinese damage to the waters of the West Philippine Sea, or similar damage being inflicted by Chinese fishing craft off the waters of Argentina and Chile and Peru, then they're not going to change. And so I would say, get those academic studies. They're available online. Pull them up. Do a bulletized excerpt of their key points. Send them to your elected officials and your government officials. Say, look, I found this, and I noticed Group A through B, Wild West, the World Wildlife Federation, Greenpeace, none of them are saying anything. It's being done by academic groups separately from them. Maybe the government should ask these groups what they know and see what happens, and then give them a hard time if they refuse to answer, or say they won't answer. So you got to get past the traditional environmental group and traditional academic groups and go public in your own way. Your social media, write articles, letters to the editor, and send things to your elected and appointed officials. Just let the information flow and be aggressive about it. Be lawful, peaceful, but forceful and aggressive, okay? That's the only way to do it. Right now, the groups that are supposed to be hounding China about this stuff are quiet. In fact, if it weren't for the national youth movement, no one would have complained about China's behavior over the last 5 years. The American media largely ignored it. So, something to think about. Another one of my soapboxes, sorry.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Happy Sister, for those excellent responses and for your very kind words for our national youth movement for the West Philippine Sea. And I think this is another question coming from Mr. Alphonse Vita. Again, he said, from a theoretical perspective, what are your thoughts on whether the government should develop a hybrid and maritime guerrilla warfare strategy master plan for the Philippines in preparation for potential hostilities between the Philippines and nations encroaching on Philippine maritime territory? Thank you.
Well, I'm with you there. I think, and they probably are already working on it. Remember, I don't work in the classified world anymore. So the Philippines could be doing a lot without my knowledge, and thankfully so. But I do agree they need to have a 4-tiered hybrid strategy. What do we do against specific elements of gray zone operations, as they're called? I'm one who thinks gray zone operations are criminal acts. But the fact that governments haven't responded against those committing them means, after 20 years of gray zone ops, to suddenly act against them now would be an escalation. Under international law, things that you do not respond to become accepted norms over time. If you defend your rights, then you effectively have surrendered them. And to suddenly get excited and defend them makes you the aggressor. So, a strategy for dealing with gray zone operations and the escalatory steps that you can expect. And then you develop countermeasures. One of the challenges I faced as an intelligence officer many years ago was the commander said, okay, here's what I want to do. Most intel officers say, okay, this is what it'll do to the situation. That wasn't what he wanted. Put yourself in the Chinese intelligence officer's shoes. I do this. What is he going to tell his boss, and how will his boss respond to it? What are their courses of action in response to mine? Because if I know what they're going to do, then I can get ahead of them. Philippines needs to think the same way. We know what China is doing. Need to start thinking about what they might do next. Prepare countermeasures for that. Develop an assessment of how they'll react to your reaction. And then look for the indicators that they're looking to do something violent or unexpected. One other thing that I would recommend, and I wrote an article about it 6 years ago, and I'm sorry, 4 years ago. I wrote it 6, got published 4. At any rate, I'm a fan of the Philippines getting submarines. You only need 2 operational submarines, and they leave Subic or another port, go into deep water and disappear. Now, there won't be much use around Palawan Island or Titsu Island or, Second Thomas Shoal because the water's too shallow. But they'll be very, very scary in the waters in the central South China Sea and the periphery of the West Philippine Sea and the southern edge of the West Philippine Sea. So, and in the waters of the Bashi Channel, which China, by the way, has tried to buy Batanes at least once that I know of. They've tried to build a humongous casino with a helipad and a large flight deck with a huge housing complex that far exceeded the number of people who'd be in a casino. I looked at that and I thought it'd be a money loser if they don't get enough people to fill that hotel, which, by the way, was built to almost military standards. Well, it wasn't built, but it was designed to. And the Philippines prevented that from happening. Batanes is a very, very strategically important location. It's an island that can support air operations, and it puts you within anti-ship cruise missile reach of the Bashi Channel. So, I'm a fan of submarines. I'm sure Japan would give you one of their redundant submarines. It won't be new, but it'll be good enough to train on, get used to, and be a threat. And then look down the road to when you have enough money to get 1 or 2 submarines of your own. South Korea builds them very well. Japan builds them very well. And in my view, higher quality and cheaper than you get them from Europe. Certainly cheaper than we could build them. So I also think air power. Philippines needs an integrated air and missile defense system around their key facilities because China's going to threaten you with ballistic and cruise missiles, and you need air power. You don't need 200 fighter aircraft, but you need enough so that any Chinese effort to intimidate your planes has to worry about your reaction. One of the things that sometimes makes me uncomfortable around my fellow defense analysts is the majority of them think in terms of enough force to defeat. My view is you only need enough force to inflict damage and delay. You have an ally, and that ally won't sit idly by if you're attacked. But if you can defend your airspace well enough for us to get planes and so forth into your airfields, in 5 or 6 days, then the power ratio begins to shift in your favor. So think in terms of what you need for yourselves and how it helps and integrates you into whatever help you might get. That's the only addition I can make, and I'm 90% confident the Armed Forces of the Philippines are already looking at it that way. I used to work with them a lot when I was young, and they were always forward-thinking, always very professional. Emotional if you pissed them off, but very professional and thorough. Good people. Hopefully that answered the question.
Thank you so much, Captain Schuster, for the excellent response. And we have another question from our Zoom registrant, Mr. Juanito Tupas, the owner of the J. Tupas Engineering Consultancy. What if there was a collision between Chinese and Philippine vessels and consequently a Filipino was killed? Will this invoke mutual defense treaty?
That's a good question. Not automatically. Philippines would have to request consultations. Also, circumstances. If it happened during what we used to call bumper drills, it would raise alarms. We'd get excited. People get emotional. But unless the Philippines said, hey, this was deliberate and we think there's more to come, we want your help, let's talk about it, then everyone will talk about the fact the mutual defense treaty can be employed, but they won't employ it. On the other hand, if they deliberately ram a Philippine military vessel, then mutual defense treaty is almost guaranteed to come into play. My caveat to that is the previous administration would have looked for ways not to call the treaty into play. This administration would look at it and say, bring it into play. So, treaties are great and you rather have them and allies than not have them. But in the end, it's a political decision. If the military's made the decision, we would have already had consultations because the two militaries share a very similar view of the problem. That's the nature of military service. You look at a threat and you say, okay, how do I counter it? And you think in terms of what do I have and what do my partners have? And your partner looks at it and says, okay, that's a threat. What can I bring to help? And how do I bring it? But the decision to do either is a political decision, not a military one. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you very much. With respect to, to the mutual defense treaty, Captain Schuster, with what happened in August 11, with your presentation, they were trying to scissor our Philippine Coast Guard. So what could happen? I mean, what it was not the plan frigate was the one that collided with the Chinese Coast Guard. And it was intentional.
If he had cut the stern off your cutter, that would constitute a potential attack on a public vessel. And although the mutual defense treaty does not automatically come into play from that, I can tell you that there would be phone calls to Manila to ask if you wanted it. And there would also be classified phone calls to 7th Fleet from PACOM and PAC Fleet, Indo-PACOM and PAC Fleet, telling 7th Fleet, get ready to deploy something down there. They would also call PACAF and say, what can you send right away? But I can't guarantee what the political decision would be. If President Marcos said, well, not now, then it won't happen. And that doesn't mean he's evil, and it doesn't mean he's indecisive. It means that he wants to know absolutely beyond a shadow of a doubt that he can prove the case that it was deliberate before he takes an escalatory military step. it's easy for people like me to say, do action A when this happens, but I don't have the responsibility of a nation. I'm just some aging retiree sitting here sipping iced tea. So remember, presidents have to worry about their nation. It is my belief that he would call President Trump, which he has the right to do. And if Trump wasn't available, then the Secretary of Defense has to take the call. And I think he would also bring in the ambassador. And then there would be great publicity about that call so that China would know they just took a step too far. Now, what would happen next, if Carl Schuster likes to think that if he were king for a day, I would fly a flight of F-16s with some kind of armament to Clark Air Force Base. And I would ask Seventh Fleet to send at least one ship down to the South China Sea. But that's easy for me to say. Most people don't know that our shipyard problems have led us to a situation where 37% of the Navy is in maintenance. And it's normally around 25%. So the number of ships available with the number of ships we have in the Red Sea and the Med, it would be a hard decision, much harder than I'm making it sound. Ships that might be available as an LCS, Littoral Combat Ship. It would be a symbolic presence. It wouldn't last 2 minutes in a naval battle, but it could run around at pretty good high speed. It has a top speed. Some of them have a top speed of 45 knots when everything works. It'll tell China that the U.S. is interested and that we have a presence. So that's a likely decision. We'll see. But I think that if it happened, Marcos would call the White House. And there would be a lot to follow that. Most of it would not be visible to the public eye.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schuster. As a follow-up, do you think is it possible, for example, there could have been some kind of mutual defense consultations between, of course, the Philippine government through the President Marcos Jr. and President Trump, and without public knowledge? Would that be possible, Captain Schuster?
I think the odds are against that, and I say that because Washington, D.C. is a sieve. There are a lot of professional bureaucrats who would do anything to embarrass Trump. And so if they could leak the conversation, they would. And then senators would leap on it and criticize ra-da-ta-da. So I don't think any secret phone calls have taken place. They would have been leaked by now, or at least their existence would have been leaked. However, if Secretary Hegseth used one of the Allied encrypted systems to just exchange emails with his Philippine counterpart, that we could keep secret.
Mhm.
So
Okay.
our militaries work together fairly closely, and not as close, not every day, and not as close as we did when Admiral Blair was the commander at PACOM. He checked in with his defense counterparts at least twice a week when he was the commander. Fargo didn't believe in that. He figured if I want to tell him to do something, I'll do it in a formal message. So a lot of the smooth interactive communications we had under Admiral Blair disappeared under Fargo, and his successor spent his entire 3-year tour trying to repair the damage. They talk more often now, but it has not returned to the level of interaction that we had during Admiral Blair's time. And some of that's not the fault of either nation. Some of that's because of the war on terror and the focus on the Middle East. There is I'm 90% confident there is a lot of communications going on about the Middle East. When I was the plans and policy officer in the Intel department at PACOM headquarters, whenever something happened in the Middle East, there was always an effort to get Intel resources out of Pacific. And that became 40% of my day. I'm 9,000 miles from the Middle East, and it's most of my day. Because I wanted it, but because CENTCOM and others wanted the resources that were here. And so the war on terror and just incredible commitment of resources to Iraq and Afghanistan prevented, I think, the restoration of what used to exist and what could be. Anyway, hopefully it'll get better in the months ahead, because I do know that China is now a big topic.
Yes, Thank you so much, Captain Schuster. Okay, let me call on Professor Ron Lampkin for his question.
Like as you indicate, the Chinese government has said that it was not their fault, that it was the fault of the Philippine Coast Guard Charter. I'm surprised the Chinese government hasn't insisted on reimbursement for the damages to one of their ships. Okay, I just want to throw that out there. That could indicate, or it proves to me, that they really don't want to mess too much with this topic. Because they don't want it to go any farther. They want to bury it, so to speak. Okay, that's in my opinion. But anyway, the Chinese have said it's not their fault, and they came out with a statement like right away, probably a few days later. Now, I haven't been following the news too much. I haven't felt too good, but anyway, has the Philippine government come out with some kind of a statement as to their position on what happened, or basically that? Have they come out with any kind of a statement?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, they were faster than the Chinese, because one thing I like about President Marcos's government is his staff, or he understand how quick you have to get ahead of the Chinese. Their videos of the collision were out within 3 hours of the incident, and they got global distribution. China's video didn't show up for about 48 hours. Philippine government also issued a letter of protest to the Chinese embassy and publicly released its contents to the local news media. And they delivered a protest to the Chinese Foreign Ministry in Beijing, all within 24 hours. And the Philippine media has thankfully also picked up the message and carried it. And while it's no longer a headline item, I think you hit the nail on the head. China realizes they can't win this narrative battle. So they've thrown enough smoke out there to create doubt in some minds. And now they want the topic to go away. And suing the Philippines for reimbursement would bring it all out again. And the preponderance of evidence makes China look bad. And so they're not going to do it.
I agree. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Good observation.
Thank you so much, Professor Lampkin and Captain Schuster. So I would like to, this is a comment from General Edilbert Adan, and he's the trustee of the Philippine Council for Foreign Relations. Of course, he's former military, also retired military. The NYMWPS, or the National Youth Movement for the West Philippine Sea program, is vital in educating the public about the false narrative of China. Thank you so much, General Adan, for that very kind words and for your continued support to the movement. Thank you. There is a question coming from, additional comment is NYMWP's program is vital in sustaining the counter influence operations against China.
Say
Thank
that
you
again
so
about
much.
influence operations.
The NYMWPS program is vital in sustaining the counter influence operations against China. That's a comment of General Adan.
Oh, no, I'm with you 100%. In fact, if it weren't for the National Youth Movement, there'd be no countering of China's narrative. Prior to the National Youth Movement, there was no countering the Chinese narrative. You know, the past administration in the Philippines, Duterte, I think I can say it now, he's ex-president, he refused to embarrass China. He refused to expose China's behavior. He made excuses for China's behavior, even after they rammed a Philippine fishing boat and left the crew in the water. Fellow Philippine fishermen had to recover those people. And all Duterte did was say, well, we'll investigate it. I mean, so I think that one thing that y'all can take great pride in, particularly you, Dr. Lampkins, both of you, is you're the trigger that created the counter narrative movement. You opened the door for it, you led it, and it exists today because of you. So I agree with the general. My hat's off to you.
Thank you very much, Captain Sister. And of course, I cannot do this by myself. And that includes our members and officers, legal counsels, supporters of the National Youth Movement. And of course, our experts and you as our member, also an advisor, consultant, Captain Sister, and our other international experts who are part of this movement. Thank you very much. And you're a great part of the success of our movement, Captain Sister. Thank you so much. There, thank you. There's another question coming from a professorial lecturer of the University of the Philippines. Let me see. I'm sorry. Just bear with me, like what Mr. Lumpkin has said earlier. Yeah. Okay. I know that this is her question. If what is the Philippine government and the ASEAN doing about what happened in August 11? So of course we cannot speak on behalf of the Philippine government, but maybe what the question should I would just probably rephrase the question. So what should the Philippine government or the ASEAN, especially next year, the Philippines is the chair of the ASEAN next year. So I think that's how I would look at it, Kami Sister. Thank you.
It's my belief the government's probably already discussing what they should be doing as, when they become president of ASEAN. I think that the Philippines will probably pressure for a true code of conduct. And my only potential reservation about that, China doesn't adhere to the code of conduct now. And yet they were a big fan of it when it first came out because they knew they never intended to obey it. And but it's good to pressure them for it, to let the world know that, hey, these guys are bad actors and we want them to comply with international law. I think also, I'm a big fan of Justice Carpio. He brought up a proposal that the Philippine government should sue China for the environmental damage that those offshore islands have done because the effluent and toxic waste from those construction activities have contributed to the death of a broad swath of marine life in those waters.
Mhm.
Now, I don't remember what the annual income is of the Philippines fishing and crabbing industry, but I do know that it used to be several $100 million.
Mhm.
And so it's affecting not only Philippine economy, it's affecting the livelihood of a significant portion of the Philippine population.
Mhm.
And so Justice Carpio's idea of suing them was, I thought, brilliant. Of course, he's a brilliant lawyer. I'm just a guy that reads books. But for some reason, the government isn't willing to do that. And I'm sure there's some bigger strategic connection that I'm not thinking of, because remember, China is the Philippines' largest single trading partner, or it was
Mhm.
4 years ago. And so, you know, President Marcos has to think in terms of my country's strengths based on its economy. So if I don't have an alternative to China, I have to be very careful before I mess with someone that might turn that spigot off.
Mhm.
And so that serves as a constraint. I'm a big fan of President Marcos. I think
Mhm.
he's doing what he can with the cards he's been dealt.
Mhm.
Um, so we'll see. I think when they take over as chairman of ASEAN, I think that that's the time to up the pressure.
Right.
And if China acts against the Philippines for that, it becomes an action against all of ASEAN.
Mhm.
So that'll constrain China. But that's the only thing I can think of. In the short term, the only thing you can do is to continue as you are doing and be
Mhm.
prepared for the next escalation.
All right. Thank you. Yeah, I think the part of the ASEAN. He said that he will bring out a portion of the code of conduct. So he mentioned that. So
Yep.
all
It's a good
right.
thing to do. And I don't think it'll get resolved,
Yeah.
but they need to bring it up every year so that China suffers the embarrassment of being identified as someone that can't be trusted to adhere to it.
All
So,
right.
you know,
Very good. Yeah. Thank you so much. Dr. Sister, there's another question from the commander of the Philippine Coast Guard, Sir Muhammad Ansari Dikritan from Cagayan de Oro City. How can the Philippines further enhance and effectively enforce its rights as the coastal and archipelagic state through diplomatic measures and peaceful means despite the challenges occurring in the West Philippine Sea? Thank you.
I think the only options you really have, what you're doing right now from a law enforcement and physical presence, I think is very good. The only thing I would add, and it's easy for me to say, is China has done so much damage that if someone were to just fly over and photograph or somehow survey, take water samples, and just plot the damage, and then add that to the lawsuit that Dr. Carpio's talking, or Justice Carpio's talking about, I think that will have a deterrent effect, because bullies, generally speaking, are most aggressive when they can't be seen. And if they're seen as bullies,
Uh,
a country like China that is a bully but trying to masquerade itself as a crosswalk guard, exposure is worth its weight in gold. And that's the only thing I can think of that they can do differently.
okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Sister. Um,
Oh, one other thing, if I were king for a day,
yes.
I would accept, you've talked about it many times. I would put international officers from one of Philippines partners on a Philippine Coast Guard. Picture China's reaction if there had been an American Coast Guard officer on the fantail of that Philippine ship.
Mhm. That's a great suggestion, Dr. Sister. Thank you so much.
Imagine the deterrent effect it has. Would you want to be the Chinese captain who kills an American
Mhm.
in international waters?
All right.
That I'm a big fan of sharing writers. I did it in my youth.
Mhm.
It does have a deterrent effect. It also has an educational and training effect. So if we can make that happen, I think it would be a good thing.
I absolutely agree with you, Kapis. I think it's still 5 years ago, I think I was mentioning about the riders program, like what US Coast Guard has an MOU with Vietnam. So I am hoping uh, soon that the Philippines would have that kind of MOU with the US Coast Guard. Hopefully, those who are in the Philippine Coast Guard, of course, we have the commander here in Philippine Coast Guard. And of course, from those who are in the arm, we have people from the armed forces of the Philippines here, and hopefully the this will reach the President Marcos. Let's start the riders program, like what Captain Sister said, and this will benefit. Uh, this will benefit us, and I
Benefit
think it's
both countries.
definitely. And of course, what China's been doing all this illegal fishing, overfishing in our West Philippine Sea lakes. For example, the galunggong. Since 3 years ago,
Yep.
the galunggong is our, very local fish, but being overfished by China. And then when they export to the Philippines, it's been, how do you call it? They put how do you call it, chloroform, to preserve it. And when it reaches the Philippines, it's on a higher price. Imagine they're robbing our own natural resources, our fishes.
Then selling it back
They,
to you in an
yes,
inferior form. Hang on a
I
second.
know. That's why shame on you, China. Okay, we don't forget those. And also, like what Captain Schuster said, the National Youth Movement for the West Philippines had a board resolution last year already. We need to charge China. From the very beginning, they destroyed all our corals, the giant clams, you know, on how they build the artificial islands in our own territories. They have to pay for all of this. We knew that during the time of Duterte, he borrowed a lot, trillions, of course, of pesos to China. And why should we pay for all these debts to China? And yet China has bigger debts to the Philippines. I'm sorry, but I have to emphasize this one.
Yep.
President Marcos, if you are listening, please kindly do it. Thank you so much. All right. And now there is a question from Commander Lysander Ordenes. Of course, he's retired commander of the Philippine Navy and the chairman of the West Philippine Citizen. He's asking, how do we prevent this sea mishap? Captain Schuster? Thank
You mean from this sort of collision occurring again?
you. Yes,
There's nothing you can do to prevent the Chinese from being unprofessional. But I can say that your Philippine Coast Guard captain in this instance was brilliant.
Mm.
I got to be honest with you, even at my best, I could not have handled my craft as well as he did to avoid that situation. It was brilliantly done. He did everything professionally. He did everything right. So how do you prevent the Chinese from being stupid? Well, that's a tough one. I'll defer that to genetic engineering and hope for the best.
Mhm. All right. Thank you so much, Captain Schuster. There's another question, of course, how does this collision impact the already strained relationship between the Philippines and China? And what are the potential long-term consequences for regional stability? Second question, what specific articles of call regs did China violate? What are the implications? Thank you.
Two parts. I'll answer the first one first. In the greater scheme of things, the effect on tensions is nothing. Chinese were hoping to get away with an incident. They didn't. And so the rhetoric's more intense, but their actions are less aggressive. So how do you define it? Well, the tensions are higher because the rhetoric is higher, or the tensions lower because the activity has decelerated. I make the judgment that nothing's really changed. The Chinese have suffered some damage. They're going to stop and rethink. So you got a couple of months where things are going to be somewhat reduced. Second half of your question was, I've lost track. What was the second half?
What specific articles of call regs did
Oh.
China violate? What are the implications?
Yeah, the implications are that they're not very well trained, or they fixated on what they were trying to do individually rather than what they were trying to do as a team, which means they may not have had someone designated in charge. In other words, the captains may have been acting independently. In terms of coal regs, I see two things, and I don't remember the numbers, but if you look at the behavior of the Coast Guard vessel, the Chinese Coast Guard vessel, he was in an overtaking situation with the Philippine Coast Guard vessel. And as such, he was constrained by regulations to maneuver to avoid hitting the Philippine Coast Guard vessel, but was instead initially on a collision course. And then he decided to come up the Philippine vessel's starboard side, operating as water cannon. Well, Philippine vessel wasn't on fire, so why are you operating a water cannon? The Chinese guided missile destroyer, however, was on the starboard side of the Chinese Coast Guard vessel. And he was forward of the Chinese Coast Guard vessel's beam. Therefore, under international, under coal regs, if you will, or international rules of the road, he is required to avoid hitting the Coast Guard vessel. The two Coast Guard vessels have the right of way. So his options are to maintain course and speed until he is pulled ahead, or he is to turn away or do something to prevent the situation becoming dangerous, because the two Coast Guard vessels had the right of way over him. Now, the exception to that is the Chinese Coast Guard vessel can't turn to the right because the guided missile destroyer is on his starboard side. So if it's a situation where the Chinese Coast Guard vessel is coming at either of the Coast Guard vessels from their starboard side directly, then they have to maneuver to avoid the collision. But he wasn't, he was on the coast, he was overtaking. He was traveling faster than they were and moving forward. So the minute he turned left, he shifted his position from an overtaking position to what's known as a maneuver in extremis. Therefore, two things should have happened. The Chinese Coast Guard vessel should have gone to an all-aback bell, maneuvered to avoid the collision, and issued 5 blasts of his signal horn to signify this is a dangerous situation and I am maneuvering to avoid collision. So the Chinese DDG felt that since he was going from an overtaking to maneuvering from the right, that the Chinese Coast Guard vessel had the obligation to maneuver to prevent a collision. The problem with that is, if you look at how quickly he did it, neither Coast Guard vessel had time to react. Therefore, his maneuver should have been signaled in advance. He should have sent the international signal for, I intend to pass from your starboard side across your bow. Incredibly dumb. A smarter move would have been to decelerate, let the Chinese Coast Guard vessel pull on ahead, make what's known as an obvious maneuver to port, then accelerate and come up Philippine vessel's port side. And then the Chinese Coast Guard vessel forces the Philippine vessel to maneuver to the left, or the Chinese DDG forces the Philippine vessel to maneuver to the right. Once that Chinese Coast Guard vessel is off the Philippine vessel's beam, he is now on the Philippine vessel's starboard side. And under the rules of the road, he must either overtake or he must maintain course and speed. He's on the Philippine vessel's starboard side, so the Philippine vessel cannot maneuver to starboard. He is what's known as the burdened vessel. He is burdened to stay on course and speed. That is the situation the Philippine vessel is trying to avoid.
Thank you so much, Captain Jesus.
Sure.
I just have a follow-up question on this one. Do you think there is some kinds of a language barrier factor between the Chinese Coast Guard and the planned frigate?
Possible.
Why this happened?
Possible. It's possible, but I don't think it's a major factor. And here's why I say it's possible. The PLA Navy uses Mandarin, which is the official. All their communications are in Mandarin. Everything they do is in Mandarin.
All right.
The Coast Guard's official communications are in Mandarin, but the crews typically speak the dialect of wherever that ship is stationed or from wherever they recruited their crew.
Oh,
Okay?
that makes sense, yeah.
But having said that, President Xi, starting in 2012, has forced all the local radio stations to reduce their local language broadcast and replace it with Mandarin. At first, it was like 1 hour a day, then it became 2. Now it's 8 or 10. So licensed radio, commercial equivalent to commercial radios in China now use Mandarin for most of their broadcast day. And Mandarin education has been emphasized in military training and in their schools. So the possibility of a misunderstanding, while it exists, I don't think it's big. 10 years ago, different story. 25 years ago, definitely a possible problem. But today, it might be a problem, but it's not a big one.
All right. Thank you so much.
Also,
Captain Jesus.
the international symbols that you use and the international signals that you use at sea, Chinese have translated them into Chinese characters. And the Chinese characters are not phonetic. So it doesn't matter what dialect you speak, your rules of the road document is in a writing system that you grew up learning. And they can read very well. So if they're doing everything legally and right, they don't need to speak, except in an emergency.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Captain Jesus. There is a question from Mr. Leo Pereira. He's a consultant of a hospitality company, Costa del Hanino in Nasugbu, Batangas. Is China bent on conducting maritime sea lane blockade in West Philippine Sea prior to invasion of Taiwan, Palawan, and Babuyan Island Group? I know these are. Thank you.
I'm sure they considered it. They probably even planned it. Here's what I think they'll do. We and most of the world consider it a blockade. But understand China's official position. Taiwan is a rebel province. So under international law, any country can establish a maritime exclusion zone around any of its territory that is in rebellion or trying to break away from its control or has some other emergency that requires that government to maintain total control over the waters and airspace into and out of that territory. So China would more likely call it a maritime exclusion zone.
Mhm.
They don't require UN approval to close your own territorial seas and airspace. You do have to inform the UN, but you don't have to have the UN's permission under international law.
Oh.
Now, then that puts the following situation in play. If Taiwan tries to break the blockade, then China will justify the launch of the conflict on Taiwan. If the United States or some other foreign power escorts a convoy of food, supplies, and medical and so forth through the blockade into Taiwan, I'm 90% certain China will back down. But the international legal rhetoric they will employ is the United States or those other countries or that other country has intervened in a civil conflict within Chinese sovereign territory, waters, and airspace. The other thing, too, is I don't think China will do a traditional blockade. I think they'll have ships out there inspecting and so forth. They won't seize any ships, they'll board and inspect. But if it's something critical and they want shipping to stop going there, they'll put my view. By the way, I brought this up in a seminar that had U.S. government representatives 2 years ago. And they laughed. They said no one would ever waste a ballistic missile on a merchant ship. This was, of course, before the Houthis started launching ballistic missiles into merchant ships in the Red Sea. And I said, look, one ballistic missile hits one super tanker off the coast of Taiwan. No one's taking a super tanker into those waters. There is no alternate route to get there. They can't go around the Horn or something like that. I said, if someone blockades the Red Sea, it'll cost a lot of money and time to go around Africa, but guess what? You have an alternative route. Someone sinks some supertanker in the Bashi Channel. How else do you get into Taiwan? Their ports on their East Coast aren't that large, or at least they weren't 4 years ago. So I think you'll look at a combination of Coast Guard backed by Navy. I think their maritime security agency will blockade the offshore islands that Taiwan has, and then back whatever they're doing with missile closure areas. No one wants to go through a missile closure. And we're doing it for training. It's our territorial water. We can do what we want. Of course, we'll reject that. But from their perspective and from the perspective of like-minded countries and organizations, they're making a legitimate claim. Now, if that fails, they back down. Many Americans would interpret that to mean we've won. But I want you to remember something. In 1979, China invaded Vietnam and got a horrendous beating from second-line Vietnamese forces, and they were forced to withdraw. Most Americans think that's when the war ended. It didn't end then. China made the announcement and told their own people, well, we just did that to teach them a lesson. Now we're withdrawing in the name of peace, ra-da-ta-da. The fighting continued till 1991. China used the war with Vietnam to develop and practice and refine their current military doctrine. They did a division-sized raid across the border into Vietnam in 1984. And they did a larger one, a battalion raid in 1984, and they did a division one in 1986. The lead company commander who authored the tactics of that successful assault is now a deputy chief of China's Central Military Commission. China had no special forces before the fighting with Vietnam. The moment they pulled their forces back, they formed Special Operations Forces, and they've spent 40 years refining them. They had no Marine Corps. Mao got rid of their Marine Corps back in 1958.
Mhm.
Because they couldn't conduct amphibious landings on the Vietnamese coast, Deng Xiaoping formed a new Marine Corps in 1980. Is there anyone thinks they don't have a Marine Corps now that they can't do landings? So here's what I'm arguing. They'll try a maritime exclusion zone. We'll call it a blockade. I personally think it is a blockade, but I won't be one of the people in charge. If we're smart enough to challenge it, China will look at it and say, not worth the fight. Pull back. We'll declare victory. Everybody will go home and relax. And they'll start preparing for their next move, just like they did the Vietnamese in the 80s. By the time a peace treaty was signed in 1991, the Vietnamese had lost 50% more people than China. The Chinese got better every year. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, Vietnam realized that they were equipment losses weren't going to be replaced, and they weren't going to come from India or the United States. So they signed a peace treaty. Now, Taiwan, if they're hit with a blockade, the blockade fails, what's next? That is a tough question. You can't invade Taiwan without some kind of bombardment campaign to damage or destroy the resistance. But there are a lot of subtle things you can do to make life difficult to generate political pressure. One is you can cut all the undersea cables around Taiwan,
Mhm.
forcing them to rely on satellite communications, which can be jammed or destroyed. They'll probably choose jamming and cyber warfare so that it's not, shall we say, physically obvious. And hope that the suffering they've imposed and the lifestyle disruption and the financial disruption will make the Taiwanese people seek some sort of accommodation. Remember, in Chinese military doctrine, political warfare considerations are equal, if not above, military considerations. They're in it for the long haul. We're in it for, okay, we won today. Now we can walk away, celebrate victory. And the Chinese know that. So there is no single scenario where they'll do something. But I do think they'll do a series of escalatory actions.
Thank you so much, Captain Schuster, for those excellent responses and insights. There's a question from Captain Med Velasco. I think this will be our last question, right? Let's see. Given the August 11th collision between how the two Chinese vessels, between two Chinese vessels in the West Philippine Sea, how should the Philippines strengthen its legal, diplomatic, and security strategies to ensure our sovereignty is upheld and to protect Filipino fisherfolk in the area?
Do what you're doing now. Maintain a presence, record everything the Chinese do, protest their actions, get between them and your fishermen, and then make them, prove they're the bully.
Mhm.
Bullies are most aggressive when they're away from the public eye. They tend to be more constrained when they know the world is watching. So, have a robust presence, maintain your Coast Guard vessels in the best condition that you can, and embarrass the Chinese through evidence at every opportunity. Until you have sufficient force capabilities to do more than that, I wouldn't do more. Of course, if they physically attack a vessel, you have the right under international law to defend yourselves, and that becomes an act of war no one can ignore.
All right. Thank you so much, Captain Schuster. I think I'm just gonna read some few questions here in our Q&A chat. This is coming from Captain Med Velasco also. Other countries such as Vietnam and Malaysia continue to explore and exploit their oil and gas reserves within China's so-called 10 dash line. Why do you think the Philippines has not been able to do the same? Is it primarily because of China's increasing aggressiveness, as seen in the recent collision incident, or are there deeper political and institutional reasons holding us back?
That I don't. Well, that's a tough one. Here's what I think. Malaysia is lucky. China is not ready to start dealing with them.
Mm.
Okay. And as a result, they can drill whatever they want. And China's got what I call a priority challenge. Do they have the resources to bully Malaysia and the Philippines and Vietnam? And the answer is not likely, because they get away with a lot by ignoring Malaysia. That allows them to concentrate on Vietnam, and the Philippines. Secondly, the Philippines is drilling, but they're drilling in their own territorial waters, as recognized by China. They tried to drill in their economic exclusion zone, which is within the 9-dash line, and the Chinese military harassed the drill, the exploration so aggressively and so flagrantly that Vietnam had to shut it down and repay the foreign contractors $1 billion. Now, I'm going to make a third statement here. If the Philippines had used their cash when they had it from Malacampaya to explore before China took an interest in Philippines waters, in other words, in the mid-90s and turn of this century, then the oil field would already be in place and it'd be a fait accompli. That isn't what happened. Politicians took the money that was being made then and turned it all over to government revenues or whatever purpose they wanted, with no thought of the fact that oil fields deplete over time. Second thing that happened was the Duterte administration made life so difficult for the foreign oil companies, forcing them to sell out their portion at a loss, that certainly American oil companies are no longer interested in drilling. And so you need to borrow money to drill now. And borrowing money means you've got to convince the people loaning you the money that they're going to get a return on it. And they're not certain that the drilling will actually take place. Now, I could be exaggerating that because I'm not an international banker. You can tell by the fact I'm not wearing a suit. But I do read financial market journals and so forth. And the South China Sea is not considered a good investment area outside of the waters off Malaysia and the waters off Indonesia. And I'm one who thinks that is because if the Vietnamese try to drill outside their 12-mile limit, they're going to wake up with a Chinese military operation. Won't invade it, but they'll bump the supply boats, cut them off, and so forth. And there is a feeling in the Philippines and elsewhere that China would impede any Philippine exploration effort. And that may be true, but it's also widely known that you don't have the money to go it on your own. So, that very difficult note and unpleasant, and I wish it wasn't true, And in fact, part of me hopes, a major part of me hopes that I'm wrong, but you need cash to drill. You need confidence in how you'll expend that cash and what you might achieve drilling to get the cash. Last week, we talked about the nuclear power plant on Bataan. I read we used to be required, if you served on a nuclear ship, you were required to read all the safety bulletins and any report of any problems with a nuclear reactor anywhere in the world. And here's the problem with Bataan. They say there were charges of corruption, allegations. And the reason they were just allegations is no one was ever taken to court. But here's what the nuclear inspectors found. The containment area of a nuclear reactor requires the world's most expensive and strongest concrete. That concrete was delivered to the Philippines, but it was never used on the construction site. Instead of that very expensive and required concrete, a cheap local mix was used to build the containment wall. So when the inspectors went out there and inspected it, neither the reactor foundation nor the containment wall met the required levels of strength. And no one could tell the inspectors what happened to the concrete. We could prove it was delivered to the country, but no one could prove what happened to it after that. So you have a $1.5 billion nuclear reactor that you can't use because somebody misallocated $12 billion of concrete. And the only way they can make that reactor safe to operate is to tear down the entire exterior structure and put in a legitimate containment wall and foundational structure. And that will cost several $100 million. And there's no confidence that if the concrete is delivered, it'll actually be used for its intended purpose.
Mhm.
So if you're going to drill, you got to convince someone with money that you're going to drill and that there's a high probability something will be discovered. The professionals I have talked to, both Western and Filipino, and I don't talk to heavy hitters, I talk to basic engineers and guys that go to Chamber of Commerce meetings. 90% of them believe the oil is there. It's deeper. It might not be in the same exact location, but it's definitely deeper, which means you're going to spend about $2 billion drilling for it. And your hope is that you're going to get 80 to $90 billion worth of oil or natural gas out of it in the lifetime of the field. But you'll notice my key phrase in the beginning. You have to believe the drilling will take place. Even with a 90% confidence there's oil there, $1 billion is a lot of money, even inflated dollars. And if someone invests that money and no drilling takes place because of Chinese pressure or an unwillingness to face Chinese pressure, then somebody's out $1 billion. So, I mean, that's the harsh economic reality. And I think that's what the engineer was talking about last week when he talked about, the factors that affect what's going on. What a minor junior oil executive told me 25 years ago when we were looking at, how do we get alternate oil, oil sources and so forth in the waters off South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia. And he said, well, keep in mind that because there will be environmental challenges, there'll be legal challenges. $1 billion, in those days, it was 500 million to drill. says you've got 500 million to drill, you need at least 300 million to fight all the environmental studies, lawsuits, and so forth. And then it's 10 years before you get your first drop of oil. So the best thing to do is take the income you're now making and use that to expand your production. Because interest rates 25 years ago were around 6%. So if you borrowed $1 billion, your interest payments are $60 million a year. No, 600 million a year. So, no, 60 million a year. So, the economics are against you. It's a mixture of confidence and economics. Get the confidence, and the rest will probably follow.
Yeah, thank you so much, Captain Schuster. Yeah, I know I would like to add more on that one. You said that needs like $60 million a year, but just to let you know, those two service contractors, S38 in Malampaya, they are earning 100 million pesos a day, 50 million pesos a day for each of them, of course, So for me, there should be money on the side of the government if the government took over 100% control of the Malampaya. So,
Or at least sat down and said, do like most countries do and say, okay, for every dollar of oil you pull out of the ground, you're going to pay us 25 cents or 10 cents, even 10 cents.
right.
And I'll give you an idea. And this is 50 years old, so it's not the same now as it was then. But 50 years ago, when we were providing security to Saudi oil fields, I found out it cost the Saudis $1.25 to bring 1 barrel of oil out of the ground.
Mm.
Saudi Arabia was selling that 1 barrel for $80 a barrel. The royalty to the Saudi government was 10% of that profit margin.
Mm.
So they were bringing 11 million barrels of oil out a day, $880 million a day in income. $88 million a day went directly to the Saudi Arabian government. And that not only funded operations, but Aramco took a portion of the 880 and put it into drilling new oil wells. I'm not Filipino, I don't know your laws. But if you can get the legislature to say, let's review that contract, we want 25% of what these contractors are making for us to use for the benefit of the Philippine people, or something along those lines. But once again, that's easy for me to say. I don't know your laws. I don't know the consequences or the impact. So,
No, I understand, Captain Schuster, but of course you're right. We all knew that these service contractors were, they were not even qualified to become so-called service contractors because they did not meet the technical capabilities for both of them. Okay.
Yep.
So the first one was during the time of Duterte, from Chevron to Odena. I have to mention now, because since we are talking about this, but I'm not gonna elaborate on it. And of course, during the time of President Marcos, there was the Enrique Razon, the so-called now Prime Infra, bought the MEXP, that's the specs or the shell exploration, bought by Dennis Uy from Shell. And then Enrique Razon bought it from Dennis Uy. That becomes the Prime Infra. So these are the service contractors, I have to mention this too because it's not any way private. And right now they are doing the drilling of new wells that is based on the extension of the service contract up to 2039. Because, uh, uh, because of the PD 87, you are only entitled for another 15 years because it expired in 2024 last year in February 2022. However, what we see the problem in this service contract extension of SC38 in Malampaya, they would be paid even they won't find a gas, even there's no production. So that is the,
That's a
I
bad
mean, the
contract.
negative part. The Philippine government will lose money. For these service contractors, they have nothing to lose. Whether they don't find anything, they will be reimbursed. So, but that's not how it is stated in the PD 87, like what happened to Chevron and Shell, you know, 25 years ago. Anyway, I'm just saying that for those who are listening and those who have been heard about this Malampaya, and as you know, why the National Youth Movement for the West Philippines is also advocating for Malampaya, because the fourth goal of the National Youth Movement for the West Philippines Sea is also to preserve uh, our natural resources that includes our marine life, the oil and gas, and in the West Philippine Sea. So this is not only about the Malampaya. Also, we have the Reed Bank or the Recto Bank. So I'm not gonna elaborate anymore because that will be another topic that we can be, we've been talking about that. Thank you so much, Captain Schuster, for all those excellent insights and for giving us a history about the Bataan nuclear plant. And that's the first time I heard that kind of the fact and why it never became operational because of that. Uh, I would say deficiency, or uh, there's a default in the construction, not in itself. You have a question for us? Okay, thank you. Captain Sister, there's a last question I would say of the Leo Sencio Ferrer. What is the probability that PLA will use drone-borne explosives against our ships?
Almost nothing unless they decide to go to war. That's an act of war. China prefers to achieve their objectives without that. So
Yeah.
they'll harass you with drones.
Mhm.
They may not drop
Right.
explosives, but who knows? They might drop manure, they might drop smoke grenades, or they may just zoom in and harass you. They won't use explosives unless they've made the decision to go to war.
All right. Thank you so much, Captain Sister. I know there's a question from Sir Alphonse Vida. Just to let you know, Sir Alphonse Vida is also a member of the National Youth Movement for the West Philippine Sea. He should be in the Philippine Military Academy, but since he became a member of the National Youth Movement for the West Philippine Sea, attending our international uh, conferences, and of course, with the influence, of course, like you, Captain Schuster, and all other experts, he is now into the international studies. So his question now is, what are your thoughts on Taiwan's porcupine strategy? What can the Philippines learn and adapt from Taiwan's strategy of inflicting as much damage to the PLA? Or should the Philippines adapt and consider guerrilla fighting capacities in the event that a war break out? Thank you.
I would argue both. The thing about a hedgehog strategy is, a porcupine strategy, is most people think it refers to waiting until the enemy's on your shore. Taiwan, like the Philippines, Taiwan's a big island, one island. Philippines is a series of islands, but nonetheless, you can't march from China to the Philippines or march from China to Taiwan. You got to cross a body of water. So Taiwan's porcupine strategy is three-layered, in my view. Number one, hold on to you and defend your airspace and the Taiwanese people. That is the porcupine. But also they have fast attack boats. They're getting a new submarine. They hope to have a couple of new submarines by 2030. They've got unmanned submarines, and they've got unmanned drones. And they've got supersonic anti-ship cruise missiles. They've got integrated air and missile defense. So their plan is, or appears to be, to be honest with you, I don't work with that stuff anymore. But if you read the press articles and stuff, the first tier is to make it very dangerous for any aircraft trying to bomb Taiwan, and protect the Taiwanese people as much as possible from Chinese missiles. The second priority is to make it very dangerous for Chinese naval vessels to bring troops across the Taiwan Strait. It's very expensive to fight a battalion of well-armed and trained troops on your beach. One torpedo into an amphib ship and that battalion is gone, and you haven't had to fire a shot. And they've now got to spend a hell of a lot of effort hunting down that submarine. Submarines are like a gorilla in the jungle. It takes 10 times as much to find and kill them as it does to fund the gorilla. So, missiles, fast attack craft, submarines, and then as the final layer, naval mines. Naval mines, particularly bottom mines, are almost impossible to defeat. The only way to get rid of them is to send robots down there and physically find them and destroy them one at a time. An alternate strategy is to send a couple of ships you don't give a damn about through the minefield multiple times until you've exploded enough of the mines where it's safe for those you care about to go through. When I first came in the Navy, by the way, we used to have these old World War II merchant ships filled with ping pong balls and flotation ladders. They're in a remote control system. Their job was to steam through minefields and set off the mines.
Mm.
It was a job for a lieutenant, which told me they didn't expect the ship to survive because no one cares about lieutenants. But the point is, mines are a problem. You encounter mines off an invasion beach, you wait till the mines are clear. So that's the second tier. The third tier is their training to conduct guerrilla warfare. Or at least they appear to be based on the drills in their last exercise. Chinese invade Taiwan, they're going to be fighting in the underground, in the subway stations, in the mountains. It is going to be a very expensive process.
Mm-hmm.
So what does that tell the Philippines? Well, you have a similar problem with the advantage of greater distance even. One of the reasons China has built those military bases in your waters is so they have forces closer to you. But if the Philippines had submarines, you can make life very difficult for the people trying to supply those islands. If you had missiles and drones, you can make it very expensive to even walk on one of those islands. Picture a drone swarm flying overhead while you're trying to go to a headquarters building from your hotel or barracks or whatever. You know, it's like that movie from, it's like the scene from, I forgot the name of the movie, but The Matrix, where all the evil things are coming to this guy with a machine gun. Well, drone swarms have that effect psychologically. So build what you're building, get an integrated air and missile defense. Right now, make sure you can make it dangerous for the Chinese Navy to piss you off. That's what supersonic anti-ship cruise missiles do. Mm-hmm. Drones and aircraft make ship commanders nervous. And you only need 2 to 3 submarines. I would start with 2 and get some air power. The beauty of air power is you can load a couple of anti-ship missiles on it or attack missiles for their airfields, fly away from the main target, refuel, and come in from a different direction. In other words, it gives you a lot of options that makes the attacker have to worry about what he needs to do to make sure he gets to your country. And then I personally don't think China would invade Philippines. And the reason is you have a history of being guerrilla fighters. And the Chinese hate insurgency and counterinsurgency. You're too big and there are too many of you to do the same tactics they used in Xinjiang.
Mm.
In Xinjiang, they hauled off 10% of the population and put them in concentration camps because there's only like 2 million Uyghurs. So put 1 million of them in camps, you got 50% of the population. You can't do that in the Philippines. Not even the Spanish could do it, and they tried. So they might do something to force you to become benign towards them. In other words, run a series of attacks, interfere with your public services, make life painful, ugly, and untenable here in the Philippines. But I don't see them invading you, at least not directly. They might try some kind of subterfuge. They might say, for example, go after one of your offshore islands. They could cut off your access to the sea. But putting a land force on the Philippines, even if you win the military campaign, the Japanese lost 15% of the troops they put in the Philippines to Filipino guerrilla action. And some of the units that weren't killed directly had trouble finding food. They had to live off the countryside because their convoys kept getting ambushed. So your history is in your favor. What you do have to worry about is losing control of the waters off your coast.
Mm.
And China's actively looking at that. Remember the carrier that operate off your eastern coast.
Mm.
If they're able to take control of those waters, you can't ship either way. So
That's good. Thank you. Thank you so much, Captain Schuster, for those excellent responses and insights. There's a question here that do you buy the idea that plan intentionally blocked the Chinese Coast Guard during the collision incident,
no,
considering that they could really avoid such incident given their sophisticated sensors in a broad daylight?
no. There's no way he did it deliberately. He did it stupidly, perhaps.
Mhm.
But
Thank
the Coast Guard ship, Chinese Coast Guard vessels are designed to ram smaller ships.
you. Mm. Okay.
And so it's my belief they had the okay to ram that Philippine Coast Guard vessel because look at them. They made the Chinese Coast Guard ship made 3 attempts to do it.
Mhm.
And he had his water cannon operating, so he clearly intended to disable the Philippine ship if he couldn't ram them. So there's no way the PLA Navy ship would deliberately block that Coast Guard ship. For one thing, if the Coast Guard ship had hit him directly, midships, he would have opened a hole in the naval ship's hull. And Chinese execute captains for doing that sort of stupidity. His job's gone. He's going to be stripped of his offices and stuff for what he did. Once all the publicity dies down, they'll try to figure out a way to publicly declare him a hero and then tell him to, find it. But no, they wouldn't do it deliberately. One thing, that's an $800 million ship and
Mhm.
$300 million Coast Guard
Wow.
ship. So, you're not going to risk $1.1 billion in that fast.
All right. Thank you so much, Captain Schuster. Of course, I know Captain Med Velasco was raising his hand, but I don't see his question here. I know this is like a last comment of our member, Mr. Alphonse Vita. I'm sure the government's speed at releasing the videos and reporting on the incident were all informed due in part to the National Youth Movement for the West Philippine Sea, Captain Schuster, Colonel Ray Powell, and our other experts' advice and activism at our need to illuminate the gray zone. Anyway, that's of course. Thank you so much, Sir Fon. So basically, all the questions were answered. I'm sorry. Is there any question here? No, Captain Sister, you have answered most of those, I would say, very significant questions and with your excellent responses. Just to update you, I'm not sure if you're aware about this. This is true. I think this was in August 20. Since the collision happened in August 11 near in Scarborough Shoal, right in our West Philippine Sea. Not exactly in the Scarborough Shoal, but uh, because as you know, the Philippine Coast Guard cannot even be there, since it's being occupied by China since 2012. Now they went to Ayungin Shoal, and the Chinese Coast Guard was trying to be near the BRP Sierra Madre and Ayungin Shoal. So what the Philippine Coast Guard rubber boats, two of them were trying to block the Chinese Coast Guard to be near the Ayungin Shoal, and they used this time drone. I think maybe somebody's listening to your presentation, Captain Schuster. You know that was your presentation the other time or 2 weeks ago, right? So it happened already, and they have some kind of an aircraft on top, and there's some militia vessels also. So now they are now down there in the Spratlys after the Scarborough Shoal collision. So I'm just letting you know uh, this is the recent incident actually.
Well,
But
thank you.
thank you so
Of
much.
course, the youth movement's been talking about drones now for about 9 months. And I'm glad to see that they're being used. They're a cheaper alternative, and because of what's going on in Ukraine, most military personnel have a natural fear of drones overhead now because, 2 years ago you saw them as purely some kind of civilian nuisance. But now that
Mm,
Ukraine and Russia have used them and Israel and Iran and the Hezbollah and the Houthis have used them for combat, you can't relax when there are drones overhead. And
mm,
so
right.
that's very wise using them.
I know. Thank you so much. So Chinese learned from your presentation, Captain Schuster. They
Yeah,
used the drone in the August 20 incident, all right? So, and
yep.
hopefully, of course, I think the armed forces of the Philippines, they have such a program. That's what I read before. So hopefully. So again, of course, thank you very much, Captain Schuster, for this uh, your excellent presentation and insights and the facts that we learned today. And hopefully, of course, this will not be the last. And even though you're gonna be on vacation for some time, you will be with us again. So upon your availability as my co-host again for the new West Philippine Sea Catch, and for those participants who you for your questions, thank you very much. And before we would like to, we would before we're gonna end this webinar, we would like to acknowledge you know, some participants. Of course, General Edilberto Adan. We have Sir Jeffrey De Cepeda, he's a lieutenant of the Philippine Navy. We have Mr. Robert Ryan Farol. Uh, he's the he is the research analyst of the Office for Strategic Studies and Strategy Management of the Armed Forces of the Philippines, of course, in Quezon City. Uh, Ma'am Virgin, I'm sorry I can't mention that. The one from the Department of Science and Technology. And we have uh, a station manager of the Armed Forces of the Philippines, Francel Padilla. We have, of course, a personnel officer again from the Philippine Navy, and of course, our very own member, Mr. Alphonse Vita. And we have also a guest coming from Nanhua University in Taiwan. And and of course, from the Embassy of Vietnam in the Philippines. Uh, of course, Ma'am Ni from the professor from UP Baguio. Sir Juanito Tupas, I mentioned the owner of J. Tupas Engineering Consultancy. I do apologize for my voice. Thank God that, I'm better now compared to yesterday. And we have the enlisted personnel from the Philippine Army, Sir Meldorn Lara from Lawag. And we have Mr. uh, Joseph Huachon. He's the head of security of a private security industry in Manila. We have Commander Muhammad Ansari Dikritan, Commander of the Philippine Coast Guard. Thank you so much po sa inyong lahat. And, we have a legal officer, of course, from the Philippine Coast Guard. We have I'm sorry. Okay. We have a consul, Honorable Consul John Francis Herrera from the Department of Foreign Affairs, is a consul down there in Shanghai, China. Of course, that's from our Department of Foreign Affairs. That's why I thank the Department of Foreign Affairs Secretary Teresa Lazaro, the office. Thank you very much po. We have the somebody from India, Yadav Sani from Panjim, India. And of course, from the Armed Forces of the Philippines, is an OIC. And we have somebody again from the Philippine Embassy of Ankara, Turkey. And attorney, doctor, the cardiologist actually, Ariel Balones, thank you very much, and attorney Irene Balones. We have Dr. Greg Mariano from the U.S. mainland, and of course, General Eduardo de Valan, Commander Leisanes Ordenes. We have a planner from a national government. I'm not allowed to mention the name. And we have somebody again from a government entity. And all right, this is coming from Panatag Pamalakaya Sambales. That is an organization of fisher folk in the Philippines from Masinloc, Sambales. Thank you very much, Mr. Joselito Marabe. And we have, of course, somebody from the Philippine Air Force, an admin officer. And of course, Mr. Leo Crescente Ferrer from the Costa del Hamilo in Nasugbu. And we have, of course, Captain Med Velasco, the CEO of Mico Air Rescue. And Mr. A private citizen. And of course, our attorney, Lloyda Nicholas Lewis from New York City. We have Dr. Dries Larafi from the University IB Antofagasta of Morocco. And to our, of course, to our netizens who are watching now live in the FB page of the National Youth Movement for the West Philippine Sea, and to all officers, members, supporters, followers, thank you very much po, and maraming salamat for following us, supporting us. So you will be updated and learn more facts and insights on what's really happening in our West Philippine Sea. All right. And now I think um, I would like to make an announcement first. And on Saturday, that will be August 30. August 30, right? Uh, our our guest speaker would be Dr. Satoru Nagao. He is a maritime and national security expert from Tokyo, Japan. And of course, as you know, there are agreements now with Japan and the Philippines. So he'll be discussing more a lot of this on Saturday. I'll be sending you the invite again for Saturday, and I'm not sure Capisuso will be with us, but he said that there's gonna be like a Wi-Fi on the place he's gonna be going. He'll be joining us, and we appreciate that, Doctor Capisuso. Thank you very much. And you know, of course, I would like to share. I don't want to forget about this. Uh, it will take only a second, I would say. Uh, this is about on how to be a member of the National Youth Movement for the West Philippines. All right, all right. Who are eligible to the National Youth Movement for the West Philippine Sea? Of course, you know, any Filipino or of Filipino descent, ages 6 to 40 for the youth sector, uh, minors who are 6 years to 17 years old, you know, definitely we need a guardian or parental consent. And and of- and the membership is also open to non-Filipinos who have the same mission and goals of the national, who believe in the mission and goals of the national youth movement, the West Philippine Sea. Sorry, the membership form can be filled up at the NYMWPS website, excuse me, at nymwps.net, or you can simply send your resume with a picture at the official email address of the NYMWPS at info@nymwps.net. All right. So, and uh, and of course for our social media platforms, just please bear with me. I'm sorry. Sorry, we are just recovering from COVID. Professor Lampkin and I have COVID since Sunday. So,
Oh,
yes, I do apologize. I don't want to say that, but we are much better, thank God. And all right. Excuse me. Of course, for our social media platforms, you can take a screenshot of this one. For FB page. You have at NYMWPS, YouTube channel I am NYMWPS, Twitter NYMWPS underscore official. Of course, our website is www.nymwps.net. And despite of the malwares that's being sent to our website, but thank God we're still alive. Okay, our webmaster is into it. So I know there's a lot of factors, external factors, trying to remove our website. All right, so I don't think they will win. Just to let you know. And of course, the email address is info@nymwps.net. So, and we still would like to invite you to the 10th founding anniversary of the National Youth Movement of the West Philippine Sea that will be held on September 27, 2025, excuse me, at the Manila Prince Hotel, San Marcelino Suite, Ermita, Manila. excuse me, that would be a dinner gala and award ceremony with live performances and entertainment of various performing artists. So I will be sending you the details, and our official event poster will be posted by next week. All right. So again, of course, uh, Captain Schuster, on behalf of the National Youth Movement for the West Philippine Sea, again, I would like to extend our sincerest thanks and heartfelt gratitude and appreciation for your tireless uh, support and selflessness in sharing all your knowledge, your expertise to all of us and to all our participants. And with all of these, helping the Philippine government on strategies to counteract China's gray zone tactics in our West Philippine Sea. And we salute you for this, as always, Captain Sister. You are always with us to fight for our Philippine sovereignty and our territorial integrity. And most, if not all, but I'm sure they will be implementing. They have been, excuse me, they have been implementing your recommendations since, I would say, um, 5 years ago, but they are now being implemented in 2022, the 20, up to now. So maraming salamat. Thank you very much, Captain Schuster, for helping us in winning this battle against China. Thank you very much.
You're welcome,
That's
my
it.
pleasure. And thank you for your leadership and thank you for having me. And so you guys, I hope you get better. I've never had COVID, but I did have RSV. And let me say, for a disease that sucks, it's not that bad, but you can't gamble with it. So take care of your health first, okay?
Thank you.
And so
Thank
y'all
you
have a
very
nice weekend and stay safe,
you so
stay warm.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Captain Schuster. And of course, I would like to thank my beloved husband, Professor Ron Lampkin. Uh, he always helped me, of course, in the setup of our little studio here. So I can start right away with our webinar. Thank you so much, Professor Lampkin, and also for your questions. Thank you. And to Captain Tagal, who was here earlier, thank you very much. And to Sir Pons, who was our member of the National Youth Movement, Alphonse Vida, maraming salamat. All right. So, Mr. Leo, okay, good night and good night, everyone, and to everyone who are here and who was listening. Thank you so much to all your support and participation. Okay, Captain Sister, I know it's like almost 3 o'clock there in Hawaii. So this is Dr. Celia Lampkin broadcasting live from Guam, USA, and hope to see you in Manila in September. All of you. Right. Professor Lampkin, do you have some words?
Well, yeah, anyway, Captain Schuster, as always, you're the only person I could really think of that would be the best one to discuss this topic that we've been talking about tonight. With your naval background and your particular type of naval background, I might add. Your presentations, both tonight and in the past, they're always real clear, they're real concise, and they're hands-on. And when you answer questions for people, it's the same way. you answer those questions in a way that basically the person understands. Rarely do they come back with, oh, could you explain that or whatever? You explain it. And really because of your training background, education, and sort of where you come from, there's nothing to compare. And we're very blessed to have you as a member of our movement. And let's see, to use your own words, I hope democracy was served tonight.
Thank you.
Anyway, good night, sir.
Good night. Good night, Captain Sir. Good night, everyone. Good night.